on August 11th, 2021. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the committee is practicing physical distancing. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather virtually today is a traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land, their achievements, and their contributions to our community. Colleagues, before I ask Tim Brubaker to perform roll call, I would just note that Councillor Rentz sent regrets, so I am occupying the chair with the support of the committee, and I do appreciate that. And I'll now turn to Mr. Brubaker to perform the roll call.
Thank you. Chair Redmond?
Here.
Councillor Armstrong?
Here.
Councillor Clark?
Here.
Councillor Erb?
Here.
And we have regrets from Councillor Rentz.
Thank you very much. We now need a motion to reconvene in open session. Do I have a mover? Councillor Clark, second by Councillor Erb. All those in favor? Thank you. That is carried, colleagues. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, we have no delegations registered. So the report before us is the election sign information which you have received. And I would now call on Mr. Tom Hudason to introduce the report. Welcome, Tom.
Morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for having me here this morning to bring this topic to you. I looked at this from the points that I was asked to look at it from, which was to consider reducing or eliminating election signs. And in that regard, I came up with three key considerations that could be looked at as being viable options. The first being status quo, the bylaw as it exists now. It was last updated in 2018 to include greater distances between signs, more, back 100 meters from roundabouts, these types of things. And it was a fairly comprehensive list of controls that are now on signs. So it controls materials that signs can be held up with, the size of signs, their placement regarding intersections, traffic features like street lights or traffic lights, and in relation to each other. So when we looked at it, I went to Transportation Environmental Services to see if there were any other safety concerns that would need to be addressed in the bylaw, and staff informed me that no, from their perspective, bylaw adequately controls all safety aspects that they would have concern with. So that really didn't seem to be anything that we could address. And the other consideration would be on visual blight, and being subjective in itself as to what consists of visual blight. That brings on our next option, which is adding some further restrictions or expanding some of the existing restrictions. And in that regard, I again talked to Transportation Environmental Service to see if it would be helpful to, control it at major intersections, for example, or along major commercial thoroughfares where there's already a plethora of signs. And they felt that with all the controls in the bylaw as it exists, that it really didn't add to blight because the number of signs is controlled. One candidate per intersection or per stretch of road can put one sign. And so you won't have multiple signs for one candidate in one spot. It's enough to hold as many signs from the different candidates as it will. And that would probably be more impactful on a municipal election where there are far more candidates. But that was one of the considerations. So we didn't see any extra amendment in that regard that would be effective, but to cut down on the number of signs, there were a few things that could be done, like increasing the distance allowable between signs. So you take it from 1 meter to 5 meters or whatever distance that we thought was appropriate. And that would, say, eliminate a couple of signs in a stretch of road that maybe held 5 signs would now only hold 2 or 3. And then it's, first come, first served basis. Most regional road are fairly long. You can hold a few signs. So that is one thing that could impact it. We thought it would be too difficult to ban it at certain sections, because then you just get down into too many weeds for the campaigns to look at. They're working with volunteer staff who there may be a high turnover and there may not be a lot of awareness for the placement of signs. So it could end up being there. Then we looked at some other means of controlling placement of signs. So, one is a permit system, which would say each candidate could place 100 signs. So if you get down into that, it's very difficult to know how many signs are actually out on the road. So you have problems with that kind of enforcement. Looked at a system that designated areas, for example. So if you have a space of land that would accommodate these things and under permit, they could put signs there. Another one that's difficult to oversee because boundaries change for elections. So in a municipal election, you'll have more and different boundaries, and each ward may not have access or the same type of access to regional space to have one of these permitted sections. So it would be sort of difficult to implement on that front. And either of those or both of those kinds of systems would require more administrative processes in order to oversee them, and systems would have to be put in place. And we could consider fees for these types of things for the permits as well. So these are things that could be looked at if directed to do so. The last option is the banning of election signs, which basically are legal issues and diversity and inclusion pieces that my office doesn't address, but which are included as Appendix A, I believe, in the report. So, to conclude on this, status quo is probably an adequate option in the sense that it does have a lot of controls. It does take a lot of enforcement, regardless, I think, of any method that we undertake. Signs will be illegally placed. It's just a fact of life. I've talked to municipalities who have banned election signs, and they still have to go through this exercise of going out and enforcing the bylaw. From our own perspective, it does take a lot of resources, but that is the job that we do. And for the most part, I can say that candidates are receptive when confronted with these transgressions of the bylaw. But it comes down to a number of factors as to why it's happening. And so we always take that into consideration when we're enforcing the bylaw. And to this point, that I have been involved in a couple of elections, and prior to my being involved, I don't think any charges have ever been laid under the sign bylaw for an election. And so I think that just speaks to we do get cooperation from campaigns, but those underlying factors will always remain. Volunteer staff, overturning staff that, again, aren't fully aware of how things need to be because there isn't the time or they don't have the ability. So we do educate candidates and their campaigns before the election starts, or once it's called. We do arrange meetings with candidates and their campaign managers. We give them a list of regional roads. We give them sign bylaw information handout, which illustrates pictorially how signs need to go. And then when we do get complaints, we do go back to these campaign managers and discuss what happened, why it's there. And we do remove the signs. The signs are taken to the landfill, and they have a special place where they put them. Candidates can go there and get them if they want. But it's just too resource consuming to try and hold them and return them and these types of things. So that's pretty much what we came up with, and any direction that you want to take, we can look into in more detail.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hudason. I know that Connie McDonald is has joined this meeting, and you referenced Appendix A, and I know that was a stipulation that council gave direction to this licensing and hearing committee that we look at the comments that would be made by the anti-racism advisory group and marginalized communities. So, Ms. McDonald, could you just sort of highlight what that appendix tells us?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, there's a lot of the team was asked to go back and to take an equity lens and to look at the sign bylaw from the perspective of how different groups might be affected by the ability to purchase signs or the ability to not be able to have signs on regional roads. While I can say with confidence there isn't a great body of evidence related to this topic, it would probably be a great topic for a political scientist to look specifically at the impacts on Black, Indigenous, and racialized individuals in election signs. The team was able to look at research around the issues of income and election signs, and a direct correlation between a candidate's income level and ability to purchase signs and having opportunity or the need to place more signs disadvantaged those candidates fairly significantly in the research. Do want to acknowledge that, you know, there would need to be a bit more community engagement to better understand how that has impacted residents in Waterloo region and what the experiences have been of some of those residents. But certainly the report included some considerations for council when thinking about making any potential changes.
Thank you very much for that. I would now open it to the committee for any questions. Councillor Erb?
Yeah, I'm trying to find my hand here. I have a question. Tom, you said to date you're not aware of any charges that have been laid. The charges that could be levied are fine related, if I'm correct?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, okay. And is that in this report, or in any of the information that we have? I
No.
guess, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Yes, there's nothing like that.
No, okay. And just for curiosity, what might they be?
Offhand, I don't know in my mind. I don't know if Richard is aware of what the set fines were. I haven't had much call to access these ones, and I didn't look at it in relation to this report.
Okay.
And I don't have access to my set fine book at the moment.
The comment in if signs were banned, there would still be people putting them up illegally, which I find a little bit difficult to believe that if there was this banning of signs on public roads and the candidates were in touch with the clerk's office to register as a candidate and get their nomination papers in, that they would clearly understand that that they're illegal and they wouldn't be placing them. But that may be a possibility. And then that's why I was wondering what the fines or the charges could be if that indeed did happen.
Yeah, I can sort of guess it would probably be around $200 in that area. It could be $100 or $200. In my mind, would be reasonable for that, but I have to actually check the set fine.
Yeah. Okay.
But when it came to enforcement in municipalities where signs are banned, I spoke with both Kitchener and Waterloo in this regard, and Kitchener does have, I think I was told, a significant amount of enforcement to do on their roads during an election, because signs will just pop up on sections that on their city streets as well. And the city of Brampton, I read a report that went to their council that they have a ban on election signs on municipal property. It's allowed on private property with, again, restrictions in place as to how they can be done.
Tom, did you freeze or did you stop talking? I think Tom's frozen. Elizabeth, was your question for Tom? Do we need to wait for him to thaw, or do you want to pose it?
It wasn't a question. It was a comment, so I can wait for questions.
Do you want to make your comment now while we wait for Tom to thaw?
Sure. I find the issue around cost a little bit of a red herring, because we aren't talking about banning election signs altogether. We're just talking about banning them on regional property. And I think that if we talk about costs, we're assuming that the candidates that we're concerned about being new candidates, not incumbents, younger candidates less time and less money to spend on things like canvassing and stuff. I mean, we're assuming that they are going to have an equivalent number of signs on private properties, and I don't think that's the fact. I think that candidates who are newer, who have less time to spend door knocking because of work commitments, family commitments, they're not going to do the private property signs. They're not going to have access to the private properties. In fact, I think that what we see is that those candidates purchase fewer signs. They just place them more strategically. So I think that if we were talking about banning signs altogether, I would say absolutely that's a valid point. But we're not doing that. We're talking about where they can be placed. That's my comment.
So just to be clear, when you talk about banning, we are only talking about regional road allowances. We are not talking about private property or people that can put them in the window of their apartment. We're talking about regional land, correct? And you're just saying that.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'm saying I don't think that. I think that the conversation around cost of signs assumes that everybody's going to put out the same number of signs. And we know that the impact of signs on major thoroughfares, high visibility roads like regional roads, is much greater. And I think we will find that candidates who don't have time to do door knocking, don't have a lot of friends and acquaintances who own private property, aren't incumbents, so they don't have people reaching out to them, offering sign locations. I think we will find that those candidates use primarily the regional roads and don't, in fact, use a lot of private property. So I don't think that we can assume that having regional roads available to those candidates means that they're going to spend more money on signs. They may spend less money on signs because they can place them more strategically.
Thank you for that. Okay. Councillor Erb, were you done your questions? Mr. Hudason is back and he's thought out.
Oh, yeah, I was done with him for
Okay.
now. But I would respond to the cost, and I think I would look at it a wee bit different than Councillor Clark, that because of the proliferation of regional roads and the number of signs that incumbents already place on the regional roads, that a first-time candidate, to really make any kind of an impact, does have to spend a significant amount of money, and I can attest to that as a first-time candidate last time, to keep up with the incumbents and establish some kind of a name recognition that the person is a candidate. I think that the advantage to incumbents on using regional property is significant, and it's a significant disadvantage to those who are first-time candidates in terms of cost and securing the locations.
Thank you for that. Councillor Armstrong, please go ahead.
Yeah, I've just got a couple of comments. I mean, the only thing that, if we put up a ban on regional property, is that a lot of candidates, a lot of people come to them and say, I'll take a couple of your signs to put up. And where they put them, you're assuming that they're going to put them on their front lawn. But they may, if they front on a regional road, they may put it on the boulevard for better visibility. And then the candidate is subject to the fine of putting the sign on the regional boulevard. And I think that's something that concerns me too, because then candidates and first-time candidates, for them to sit and think about, well, I got to make sure if I hand somebody a sign, I got to give them a brochure as to where they can put it and where they can't put it. And I think there's a bit of an onerous thing there, and I agree that during elections, signs can get kind of blighty, as we've come to understand. But also, what happens, with signs is it's an indication that there's an election and people need to pay attention. I mean, I look at the signs as something like, we see Christmas lights, we know the Christmas season's coming, and we start seeing carved pumpkins and stuff, and we know the Halloween season's coming. Well, you start seeing election signs and the silly season's coming. So we have to really, I think we have to really think about this before we start doing any banning of signs on the regional roads. I like the idea of maybe, if we can come up with something that will maybe lessen the blightiness of it, I think that would be much better. And as Councillor Herb says, new time candidates, there's a lot for them to, and it can be pretty expensive. I've been through it a couple of times, and I understand that even as an incumbent, it can get expensive, unless you're, rerunning, for re-election on a provincial or federal level, where you're making all kinds of money as a member of those associations. But I think we could do a little more research and maybe come up with a little more even way of putting it and addressing some of this stuff. I know it's difficult, and I agree with Tom. It's extremely difficult to enforce, and I know our people, bylaw people, go out and they bring in signs, and we end up taking them to the landfill. If the people, they're notified as best we can, but then I don't know that we've ever laid any charges on some of this stuff. So those are just my comments. We just have to prepare for the silly season and get there, I guess.
So I guess I have a couple of questions. I don't know, Jim, you're looking very pensive. Do you have another question?
No, not right now. Thank you.
So it was referenced in passing that both Kitchener and Waterloo have banned signs on public roads. And I'm wondering what their bylaw experience has been, and how, and I know that there are two-tier municipalities and upper tiers. Some of them have banned them. Can we talk about what that experience looks like, and if we consulted with Kitchener and Waterloo, who do have bans?
Yeah, so I spoke with the directors of bylaw enforcement from both those cities and from Cambridge as well. Kitchener does devote resources to election signs during an election because enough of them do turn up on their streets. Waterloo did not have as much of a problem with it from their perspective of bylaw. That when I was talking to the director there, said that the allowance, or having them allowed on regional roads, seemed to have some effect from what they saw. Other municipalities, I read the report from Brampton, and they did have a considerable number of fines that they did write during elections. And so it seems that every municipality's experience is different. From our experience, and just to address Councillor Armstrong's example of that sign on the boulevard, because the property owner wants to get that visibility on it, we would investigate it. And this is why these things can sometimes take so much time, is that we would speak with the homeowner, and find out that, yes, this is an innocent mistake. They may not realize that that's what it is. And, we address it that way. We wouldn't consider, writing a warning, let alone a ticket on something like that, because we want to be reasonable, I think, in every approach that we take to these things. And I think that's why we haven't written one yet. When we do speak with the campaigns, they are generally very receptive. And it just seems to be there are some things that they can't control. And we do take that into considerations. These aren't intentional things where they're just sending people out to scatter signs everywhere. There is some method to the madness. They do have people doing it. They do make it available to their staff, but there's a disconnect and things happen. And so, again, based on how receptive candidates are, we haven't really had an issue in that regard. But there are a lot of instances where we do have to go out and we do have to address all the complaints that come in. And during the last federal election, I believe it was, or it might have been the provincial one, I had 2 officers working full-time throughout the election to deal with signs. Because you're driving all over the region, they then have to remove signs, take them to the dump, investigate complaints, and so it becomes a full-time job.
And that actually was my next question. So you're very intuitive. Can we quantify what it costs to police our current bylaw and our extra staff brought on?
Yeah, the calculation I did the last time in regard to that election was, I think it was about $15,000 for staff time and resources.
Tom, we can't hear you. Can you just speak up a bit?
Sorry. The last time I calculated it to about $15,000 for staffing time and resources, taking allows to dumping it and these types of things, so use of the vehicles, that sort of thing.
And Councillor Armstrong alluded to the fact that the township bylaw officers take signs to the landfill site. Is that consistent by our bylaw enforcement as well as the municipal area municipalities? Is that where signs end up when they're taken down?
I believe it's not universal across all the municipalities. I think Kitchener does hold on to them and has some sort of program for returning them. I believe Waterloo takes them to the dump. They don't have that many of them, and we take them to the dump as well because the added resources that would take to maintain that.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Yeah, they do end up there if they're not claimed.
Okay.
We just don't have storage capacity here for the signs. So if they're not claimed, then they are taken to the dump. So, and I would never indicate, Tom, that your people are grumpy old people and go around and pick on everybody. But I understand it's very time consuming to listen, but then you get the occasional candidate that goes around looking for the opportunity to cause grief for their opponents within there. So that's another aspect of it too, that people are going to go around and make sure that you're aware that somebody has put the sign on their boulevard instead of their front lawn. So, but yeah, no, it's a difficult decision to make here as to how we're going to handle this, because there's so much stuff going on here that as Councillor Erb points out, the new candidates, the costs for them, and the learning curve for people when they're running for election and stuff. It's not that easy. So hopefully we can come up with a reasonable solution to sort of, I think our target is to sort of lessen the blight.
Councillor Erb?
I just, to Tom, just to be clear, did you say 15,000 or 50,000?
15.
15,000, correct, Tom? Yes.
Okay, so that would, there you've included, I think in the report that we got in April or May, there was something like 350 hours of staff time that was put into the bylaw enforcement. That's all calculated into that then?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I honestly, I don't know that this is a solution looking for a problem. I do believe that this would make a substantive change. When we asked if there were any declarations of pecuniary interest, I thought, well, I guess potentially we all have a stake in this, but what we all have on this committee as all of council is lived experience. And I would have to tell you that as somebody who, along with 4 other people, ran region-wide in 7 area municipalities, your team learns really quickly where the bylaws are enforced and where they're not. So I would suggest to you that it's never a level playing field. And I would also, I guess we would all have to acknowledge that incumbency is a really strong a component of running municipally, and that we're looking at regulations that would apply to a federal election, should we have one anytime soon, provincial election, as well as a municipal election. So I think there is a responsibility to do the prudent thing and the right thing. What the costs that we're hearing about from Mr. Hudason are costs that we currently incur. And Tom, is it fair to say that when you looked at a permitting system or area allocation, that really those further restrictions would probably increase those costs, because we would need to do a bit more policing or have a few more parameters in a future election, should we opt to go that way?
Possible that that would create more expenses. It could eliminate some others while we're at it. So the proof would be in the pudding on that one, but it does have the potential to.
And I don't know, Mr. Brubaker, is it fair to sort of outline what the process would be were we to make any changes? So clearly status quo, we all know what that looks like. To bring about any changes, can you sort of give us an outline of what that process might look like?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Anything that this committee recommends would go to council. So even if it's a recommendation for the status quo, it would go back to council to be approved. Should the committee wish to amend the bylaw, again, it would be a recommendation to council, and council could then give staff direction to prepare an amending bylaw. Our notice policy would require, because of the expanse of this bylaw across the region, it would require notice that council was going to consider an amendment. Given the impact on the public, we would probably want to have a special public input meeting to hear from delegations on the amending bylaw. Whether that would be a public input meeting of the Licensing and Hearings Committee or of council would be a procedural choice that you could make. But ultimately, then that bylaw would go to council to be approved and put into place.
Thank you very much for that.
Madam Chair, I'm not quite sure on what the expectations are for process today. If we simply receive this as information and then ask council to deal with it, or if we make a recommendation. I sense maybe we're not at a point where we have agreement for a recommendation. At our April and May meeting, the comment was made by a councillor, and I can't quite remember who it was, that there was changes made, or the new bylaw in 2018, there was a bit of chipping away at it and changes made in 2017. And we're sort of at the point where we've been taking a bit away from it every time, and it's either remain at the status quo or eliminated, was a comment that was made. My position hasn't changed, that we should be eliminating signs completely on regional roads. And I just think they have no place on public property, that they deserve to be a sign of support. And the way that support gets shown is that they are on private property. They're a plight to the land site. We're going to have this federal election potentially in 2 or 3 weeks. We're going to have one in the spring. We're going to have one in the fall. Potentially, we have election signs on our regional roads for the next 13, 14 months. There's an advantage to incumbents from my mind. The signs are made of coroplast now, which is a plastic, which is non-recyclable. The staff time, I do think there is some liability to the region, and I certainly don't want to argue with Mr. Brooks, but if volunteers place signs inappropriately that were illegal at an intersection, that block the sight line from a stop or a yield sign, who would be liable? Volunteers, including myself, put the four-way flashers on regional roads while we're putting up a sign. If there's an accident, involving that vehicle, who's at fault? Is it the region because we put those signs to be put up? So, you know, for a whole variety of reasons, I think for me, the decision is to ban them completely. But I don't know what the process is for where that decision gets made. If we take that on to regional council, or and I'm fully supportive of having a public input meeting to hear from the public as to what their opinion might be. So I'm looking for direction, I guess.
Well, thank you for those comments. And I'm definitely in the hands of the committee. I guess I would just look to Mr. Brubaker to clarify: would a public input meeting come before a decision by council or after? Or could it come both?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would recommend that a public input meeting you would want that to come after the direction from council. So, so if this committee were to make a recommendation to council to direct staff to prepare a bylaw to ban election signs on regional roads, that would go to council. And if council passed that direction to staff, then staff would prepare that bylaw. Then we would have that public input meeting, and then council would be able to consider approving such a bylaw. So I would suggest that staff need direction at this point as to what direction to take with the bylaw, be it to ban election signs or to make revisions to it, or to keep the status quo before staff can do anything else. And once that direction's made, then we would go from there as to a public input meeting or consideration by council further.
Thank you very much for that. My sense is we don't have consensus. And what we have is a variety of views, and I'm wondering if the Licensing and Hearing Committee would be amenable to take the report that we've considered today with the appendices, which is new information that council did not have, and take it back to committee for a debate and a recommendation, because irrespective of what may or may not be decided today, it will be back in the hands of committee and council. So I look to committee for direction. Councillor Erb is suggesting that we just take this report back without recommendation, because my sense is that we would have a draw, because I am in the same camp as Councillor Erb, and it sounds like Councillor Armstrong and Councillor Clark may not be there. So I look to the committee for direction. Councillor Erb has expressed his opinion. Councillor Armstrong, what's your view? Should we try to get a recommendation, or should we just take this report back to committee?
Well, I think we need to come up with some kind of direction. I mean, there's a time frame here. We're just over a year away from our own municipal election, and we want to be able to, it's not a process that happens overnight. So because if we do go with a recommendation to council to ban the signs, then we have to go through that process, which includes the public input. And like I said, that doesn't happen overnight. And so we have to come up with some kind of a recommendation. And do we want to take it to council that we ban, or do we want to have staff go back and come up with some recommendations, different levels as to what we can do, that we can choose one. Maybe they can come up with some ideas that might satisfy both or all of us on the committee as to which way it goes. So I'm not sure if that's something we should do. Let staff sort of maybe mull it over a little bit. In a month's time, maybe we can come up with something that might be in between, that we can all be satisfied with.
So, Councillor Armstrong, you're suggesting that report come back and we have another licensing and hearing committee as opposed to going back to committee of the whole, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Mr. Brubaker to speak to the timelines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in terms of sending it to committee, would be if this committee wishes to send it to the committee of the whole for a fulsome debate, we could easily put that on the September agenda. for consideration. In terms of how long it would take staff to prepare those options, as suggested by Councillor Armstrong, I would defer to Mr. Hudayson and Mr. Brooks on when that could be done for. But in terms of sending it on to Councillor Committee, we would be able to do that for the next cycle if that's the wishes of the committee.
And Mr. Brubaker, if it were to come back to licensing and hearing, that would be another cycle or not necessarily?
That would depend on how long it would take to prepare a report. The Licensing and Hearings Committee is far more flexible. We don't have a set schedule, so that would be a matter of polling people as to when there would be availability. But we would first need to have that report before we could reconvene this committee.
Thank you. Just speaking to those time frames, do Mr. Brooks or Mr. Hudayson want to weigh in at all? And then I'll go to Councillor Clark.
I would say that it would probably depend on what we were being asked to do to report back on, as to the time it would take to research that and come up with something to put back before the committee. I don't know what Richard thinks might be a reasonable time frame to consider another report going forward.
Madam Chair, my my view on it would be is that it would greatly assist to have direction about what the committee wants. I mean, if the committee today said, look, go and flush out a permit system and come back and tell us what it would look like, that would greatly assist, because I think without that, we're kind of we're guessing at what the committee wants and maybe spinning our wheels or wasting our time going down paths that ultimately council doesn't want.
Thank you very much. Councillor Clark.
Thanks. That was essentially my question. I'm not clear on what we're asking staff to provide over and above what they've already provided.
And I would agree with that. We have a report here that we got on April the 13th. We have another one from May the 19th. We have the report we received today, and basically we're being told we have the same information. There's a potential of a legal challenge, resist, and there's that. And so my sense is we have the information we need, and I would be happy to have it referred to council, being there's not unanimity here from the committee for consideration.
I can go along with that. I can go along with we send this to committee, and then we have the entire council will have an input as to where we should go.
Thank you for that clarity. I do think it puts staff at an unfair in an unfair position when we're being this vague. Councillor Clark, what's your feeling on this?
I don't think we have a choice. I think the committee sent it to licensing because they wanted this committee to do that work. But if we can't come to any sort of recommendation, then I think it has to go back to council.
So, Councillor Clark, would you be willing to move that this report be forwarded for consideration at Committee of the Whole in the next cycle of meetings?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we probably need to explain why it's going back. And it's not that we didn't do our job.
Okay, or that staff, because staff did come forward. And again, I would underscore that there is new information. Ms. McDonald did outline that, and I know that that was a really important component for you personally, so I'm pleased to see that, and we'll just acknowledge that there is no great body of work out there. Councillor Armstrong, you're seconding it? Okay, all those in favor? Thank you very much. I want to really thank staff for continuing to step up, and it will be an interesting debate to have. As I say, everybody around the horseshoe has lived experience with this, and it will be interesting to see where we land. So thank you very much for this. I'd now entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. All those in favor? Thank you very much. And again, thank you to staff for all the input. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, staff.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everybody.